This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Servile State by Hilaire Belloc. Section 2. Section 1. Definitions. The first definitions. Man, like every other organism, can only live by the transformation of his environment to his own use. He must transform his environment from a condition where it is less to a condition where it is more subservient to his needs. That special conscious and intelligent transformation of his environment, which is peculiar to the peculiar intelligence and creative faculty of man, we call the production of wealth. Wealth is a matter which has been consciously and intelligently transformed from a condition in which it is less to a condition in which it is more serviceable to a human need. Without wealth, man cannot exist. The production of it is a necessity to him, and though it proceeds from the more to the less necessary, and even to those forms of production which we call luxuries, yet in any given human society there is a certain fund and a certain amount of wealth without which human life cannot be lived. As, for instance, in England today, certain forms of cooked and elaborately prepared food, clothing, warmth, and habitation. Therefore, to control the production of wealth is to control human life itself. To refuse man the opportunity for the production of wealth is to refuse him the opportunity for life. And in general, the way in which the production of wealth is by law permitted is the only way in which citizens can legally exist. The Servile State. Wealth can only be produced by the application of human energy, mental and physical, to the forces of nature around us, and to the material which those forces inform. This human energy, so applicable to the material world and its forces, we will call labour. As for that material and those natural forces, we will call them, for the sake of shortness, by the narrow but conventionally accepted term land. It would seem, therefore, that all problems connected with the production of wealth, and all discussion thereupon, involve but two principal original factors, to wit, labour and land. But it so happens that the conscious, artificial, and intelligent action of man upon nature, corresponding to his peculiar character compared with other created beings, introduces a third factor of the utmost importance. Man proceeds to create wealth by ingenious methods of varying and often increasing complexity, and aids himself by the construction of implements. These soon become, in each new department of the production, as truly necessary to that production as labour and land. Further, any process of production takes a certain time. During that time the producer must be fed and clothed and housed, and the rest of it. There must therefore be an accumulation of wealth created in the past and reserved with the object of maintaining labour during its efforts to produce for the future. Whether it be the making of an instrument or tool, or the setting aside of a store of provisions, labour applied to land for either purpose is not producing wealth for immediate consumption. It is setting aside and reserving somewhat, and that somewhat is always necessary in varying proportions according to the simplicity or complexity of the economic society to the production of wealth. To such wealth, reserved and set aside for the purposes of future production and not for immediate consumption, whether it be in the form of instruments and tools, or in the form of stores for the maintenance of labour during the process of production, we give the name of capital. There are thus three factors in the production of all human wealth, which we may conventionally term land, capital, and labour. When we talk of the means of production, we signify land and capital combined. Thus when we say that a man is dispossessed of the means of production, or cannot produce wealth save by the leave of another who possesses the means of production, we mean that he is the master only of his labour, and has no control in any useful amount over either capital or land, or both combined. A man politically free, that is, one who enjoys the right before the law to exercise his energies when he pleases, or not at all if he does not so please, but not possessed by legal right of control over any useful amount of the means of production, we call proletarian, and any considerable class composed of such men we call a proletariat. Property is a term used for that arrangement in society whereby the control of land and wealth made from land, including therefore all the means of production, is vested in some person or corporation. Thus we may say of a building, including the land upon which it stands, that it is the property of such and such a citizen or family or college, or of the state, meaning that those who own such property are guaranteed by the law in the right to use it or withhold it from use. Private property signifies such wealth, including the means of production, as may by the arrangements of society be in the control of persons or corporations other than political bodies, of which these persons or corporations are in another aspect members. What distinguishes private property is not that the possessor thereof is less than the state, or is only part of the state, for were that so we should talk of municipal property as private property, but rather that the owner may exercise his control over it to his own advantage, and not as a trustee for society, nor in the hierarchy of political institutions. Thus Mr. Jones is a citizen of Manchester, but he does not own his private property as a citizen of Manchester. He owns it as Mr. Jones, whereas if the house next to his own be owned by the Manchester municipality, they own it only because they are a political body standing for the whole community of the town. Mr. Jones might move to Glasgow and still own his property in Manchester, but the municipality of Manchester can only own its property in connection with the corporate political life of the town. An ideal society in which the means of production should be in the hands of the political officers of the community we call collectivist, or more generally socialist. A society in which private property in land and capital, that is, the ownership and therefore the control of the means of production, is confined to some number of free citizens not large enough to determine the social mass of the state, while the rest have not such property and are therefore proletarian, we call capitalist, and the method by which wealth is produced in such a society can only be the application of labour, the determining mass of which must necessarily be proletarian, to land and capital in such fashion that, of the total wealth produced, the proletariat which labours shall only receive a portion. The two marks then defining the capitalist state. Save in this special sense of collectivist, the word socialist has either no clear meaning, or is used synonymously with other older and better known words, are that the citizens thereof are politically free, can use or withhold at will their possessions or their labour, but are also divided into capitalist and proletarian in such proportions that the state as a whole is not characterized by the institution of ownership among free citizens, but by the restriction of ownership to a section markedly less than the whole, or even to a small minority. Such a capitalist state is essentially divided into two classes of free citizens, the one capitalist or owning, and the other propertyless or proletarian. My last definition concerns the Servile state itself, and since the idea is both somewhat novel and also the subject of this book, I will not only establish, but expand its definition. The definition of the Servile State is as follows: that arrangement of society in which so considerable a number of the families and individuals are constrained by positive law to labour for the advantage of other families and individuals as to stamp the whole community with the mark of such labour, we call the Servile State. Note first certain negative limitations in the above, which must be clearly seized if we are not to lose clear thinking in a fog of metaphor and rhetoric. That society is not servile in which men are intelligently constrained to labour by enthusiasm, by a religious tenet, or indirect from a fear of destitution, or directly from love of gain, or from the common sense which teaches them that by their labour they may increase their well-being. A clear boundary exists between the servile and the non-servile condition of labour, and the conditions upon either side of that boundary utterly differ from one another. Where there is compulsion applicable by positive law to men of a certain status, such compulsion enforced in the last resort by the powers at the disposal of the State, there is the institution of slavery. And if that institution be sufficiently expanded, the whole State may be said to repose upon a servile basis, and is a Servile State. Where such formal legal status is absent, the conditions are not servile, and the difference between servitude and freedom, appreciable in 1,000 details of actual life, is most glaring in this: that the free man can refuse his labour, and use that refusal as an instrument wherewith to bargain, while the slave has no such instrument or power to bargain at all, but is dependent for his well-being upon the custom of society, backed by the regulation of such of its laws as may protect and guarantee the slave. Next, let it be observed that the State is not servile because the mere institution of slavery is to be discovered somewhere within its confines. The State is only servile when so considerable a body of forced labour is affected by the compulsion of positive law as to give a character to the whole community. Similarly, that State is not servile in which all citizens are liable to submit their energies to the compulsion of positive law, and must labour at the discretion of State officials. By loose metaphor, and for rhetorical purposes, men who dislike collectivism, for instance, or the discipline of a regiment, will talk of the servile conditions of such organizations. But for the purposes of strict definition and clear thinking, it is essential to remember that a servile condition only exists by contrast with a free condition. The servile condition is present in a society only when there is also present the free citizen for whose benefit the slave works under the compulsion of positive law. Again, it should be noted that this word servile in no way connotates the worst nor even necessarily a bad arrangement of society. This point is so clear that it should hardly delay us, but a confusion between the rhetorical and the precise use of the word servile I have discovered to embarrass public discussion of the matter so much that I must once more emphasize what should be self-evident. The discussion as to whether the institution of slavery be a good thing or a bad one, or be relatively better or worse than the other alternative institutions, has nothing whatever to do with the exact definition of that institution. Thus, monarchy consists in throwing the responsibility for the direction of society upon an individual. One can imagine some Roman of the first century praising the new imperial power, but through a muddle-headed tradition against kings, swearing that he would never tolerate a monarchy. Such a fellow would have been a very feudal critic of public affairs under a Trajan, but no more feudal than a man who swears that nothing shall make him a slave, though well prepared to accept laws that compel him to labour without his consent, under the force of public law and upon terms dictated by others. Many would argue that a man so compelled to labour, guaranteed against insecurity and against insufficiency of food, housing and clothing, promised subsistence for his old age, and a similar set of advantages for his posterity, would be a great deal better off than a free man lacking all these things. But the argument does not affect the definition attaching to the word servile. A devout Christian of blameless life, drifting upon an ice floe in the Arctic night, without food or any prospect of succour, is not so comfortably circumstanced as the Khedive of Egypt. But it would be folly in establishing the definition of the word Christians and Mohammedan to bring this contrast into account. We must, then, throughout this inquiry, keep strictly to the economic aspect of the case. Only when that is established, and when the modern tendency to the re-establishment of slavery is clear, are we free to discuss the advantages and disadvantages of the revolution through which we are passing. It must further be grasped that the essential mark of the servile institution does not depend upon the ownership of the slave by a particular master. That the institution of slavery tends to that form under the various forces composing human nature and human society is probable enough. That if, when slavery were re-established in England, a particular man would in time be found the slave not of capitalism in general, but of, say, the Shell Oil Trust in particular, is a very likely development. And we know that in societies where the institution was of immemorial antiquity, such direct possession of the slave by the free man, or corporation of free men, had come to be the rule. But my point is that such a mark is not essential to the character of slavery. As an initial phase in the institution of slavery, or even as a permanent phase marking society for an indefinite time, it is perfectly easy to conceive of a whole class rendered servile by positive law, and compelled by such law to labour for the advantage of another non-servile free class, without any direct act of possession permitted to one man over the person of another. The final contrast thus established between slave and free might be maintained by the State guaranteeing to the unfree security in their subsistence, to the free security in their property and profits, rent and interest. What would mark the slave in such a society would be his belonging to that set or status which was compelled, by no matter what definition, to labour, and was thus cut off from the other set or status, not compelled to labour, but free to labour or not, as it willed. Again, the servile state would certainly exist even though a man, being only compelled to labour during a portion of his time, were free to bargain and even to accumulate in his free time. The old lawyers used to distinguish between a serf in gross and a serf regardant. A serf in gross was one who was a serf at all times and places, and not in respect to a particular lord. A serf regardant was a serf only in his bondage to serve a particular lord. He was free as against other men. And one might perfectly well have slaves who were only slaves regardant to a particular type of employment during particular hours, but they would be slaves none the less, and if their hours were many and their class numerous, the state which they supported would be a servile state. Lastly, let it be remembered that the servile condition remains as truly an institution of the state when it attaches permanently and irrevocably at any one time to a particular set of human beings as when it attaches to a particular class throughout their lives. Thus the laws of paganism permitted the slave to be enfranchised by his master. It further permitted children or prisoners to be sold into slavery. The servile institution, though perpetually changing in the elements of its composition, was still an unchanging factor in the state. Similarly, though the state should only subject to slavery those who had less than a certain income, while leaving men free by inheritance or otherwise to pass out of, and by loss to pass into, the slave class, that slave class, though fluctuating as to its composition, would still permanently exist. Thus, if the modern industrial state shall make a law by which servile conditions shall not attach to those capable of earning more than a certain sum by their own labour, but shall attach to those who earn less than this sum, or if the modern industrial state defines manual labour in a particular fashion, renders it compulsory during a fixed time for those who undertake it, but leaves them free to turn later to other occupations if they choose, undoubtedly such distinctions, though they attach to conditions and not to individuals, establish the servile institution. Some considerable number must be manual workers by definition, and while they were so defined would be slaves. Here again the composition of the servile class would fluctuate, but the class would be permanent and large enough to stamp all society. I need not insist upon the practical effect that such a class, once established, tends to be fixed in the great majority of those which make it up, and that the individuals entering or leaving it tend to become few compared to the whole mass. There is one last point to be considered in this definition. It is this: since, in the nature of things, a free society must enforce a contract, a free society consisting in nothing else but the enforcement of free contracts, how far can that be called a servile condition which is the result of contract nominally or really free? In other words, is not a contract to labour, however freely entered into, servile of its nature when enforced by the state? For instance, I have no food or clothing, nor do I possess the means of production whereby I can produce any wealth in exchange for such. I am so circumstanced that an owner of the means of production will not allow me to access those means unless I sign a contract to serve him for a week at a wage of bare subsistence. Does the state, in enforcing that contract, make me for that week a slave? Obviously not. For the institution of slavery presupposes a certain attitude of mind in the free man and in the slave, a habit of living in either, and the stamp of both those habits upon society. No such effects are produced by a contract enforceable by the length of 1 week. The duration of human life is such, and the prospects of posterity, that the fulfilling of such a contract in no way wounds the sense of liberty and of choice. What of a month, a year, 10 years, a lifetime? Suppose an extreme case, and a destitute man to sign a contract binding him and all his children who were minors to work for a bare subsistence until his own death, or the attainment of majority of the children, whichever event might happen latest. Would the state, in forcing that contract, be making the man a slave? As undoubtedly as it would not be making him a slave in the first case, it would be making him a slave in the second. One can only say to ancient sophistical difficulties of this kind that the sense of men establishes for itself the true limits of any object as of freedom. What freedom is or is not, in so far as mere measure of time is concerned, though of course much else than time enters in, human habit determines. But the enforcing of a contract of service, certainly or probably leaving a choice after its expiration, is consonant with freedom. The enforcement of a contract probably binding one's whole life is not consonant with freedom. One binding to service a man's natural heirs is intolerable to freedom. Consider another converse point. A man binds himself to work for life and his children after him so far as the law may permit him to bind them in a particular society, but that not for bare subsistence, but for so large a wage that he will be wealthy in a few years, and his posterity, when the contract is completed, wealthier still. Does the State, in forcing such a contract, make the fortunate employee a slave? No, for it is in the essence of slavery that subsistence, or little more than subsistence, should be guaranteed to the slave. Slavery exists in order that the free should benefit by its existence, and connotes a condition in which the men subjected to it may demand secure existence, but little more. If any one were to draw an exact line, and say that a life contract enforceable by law was slavery at so many shillings a week, but ceased to be slavery after that margin, his effort would be folly. None the less, there is a standard of subsistence in any one society, the guarantee of which, or little more, under an obligation to labour by compulsion, is slavery, while the guarantee of very much more is not slavery. This verbal jugglery might be continued. It is a type of verbal difficulty apparent in every inquiry open to the professional disputant, but of no effect upon the mind of the honest inquirer, whose business is not dialectic but truth. It is always possible, by establishing a cross-section in a set of definitions, to pose the unanswerable difficulty of degree, but that will never affect the realities of the discussion. We know, for instance, what is meant by torture when it exists in a code of laws and when it is forbidden. No imaginary difficulties of degree between pulling a man's hair and scalping him, between warming him and burning him alive, will disturb a reformer whose business it is to expunge torture from some penal code. In the same way, we know what is and what is not compulsory labour, what is and what is not the servile condition. Its test is, I repeat, the withdrawal from a man of his free choice to labour or not to labour, here or there for such and such an object, and the compelling of him, by positive law, to labour for the advantage of others, who do not fall under the same compulsion. Where you have that, you have slavery, with all the manifold spiritual and political results of that ancient institution. Where you have slavery affecting a class of such considerable size as to mark and determine the character of the State, there you have the Servile State. To sum up, then, the Servile State is that in which we find so considerable a body of families and individuals distinguished from free citizens by the mark of compulsory labour as to stamp a general character upon society, and all the chief characters, good or evil, attaching to the institution of slavery will be found permeating such a state, whether the slaves be directly and personally attached to their masters, only indirectly attached to the medium of the State, or attached in a third manner through their subservience to corporations or to particular industries. The slave, so compelled to labour, will be one dispossessed of the means of production, and compelled by law to labour for the advantage of all or any who are possessed thereof. And the distinguishing mark of the slave proceeds from the special action upon him of a positive law, which first separates one body of men, the less free, from another, the more free, in the function of contract within the general body of the community. Now, from a purely servile conception of production and of the arrangement of society, we Europeans sprang. The immemorial past of Europe is a servile past. During some centuries which the Church raised, permeated, and constructed, Europe was gradually released or divorced from this immemorial and fundamental conception of slavery. To that conception, to that institution, our industrial or capitalist society is now upon its return. We are re-establishing the slave. Before proceeding to the proof of this, I shall, in the next few pages, digress to sketch very briefly the process whereby the old pagan slavery was transformed into a free society some centuries ago. I shall then outline the further process whereby the new non-servile society was wrecked at the Reformation in certain areas of Europe, and particularly in England. there was gradually produced in its stead the transitory phase of society, now nearing its end, called generally Capitalism or the Capitalist State. Such a digression, being purely historical, is not logically necessary to a consideration of our subject, but it is of great value to the reader, because the knowledge of how, in reality and in the concrete, things have moved better enables us to understand the logical process whereby they tend towards a particular goal in the future. One could prove the tendency towards the Servile state in England today to a man who knew nothing of the past of Europe, but that tendency will seem to him far more reasonably probable, far more a matter of experience and less a matter of mere deduction, when he knows what our society once was and how it changed into what we know today. The end of section 3.